Good evening. Thanks very much for joining us on India Business Hour. Budget is around the corner and last-minute consultations are on. That is our top story on industry's budget wish list. The Finance Minister today met with Corporate India, who've made it clear that they will oppose the inheritance tax or any tax on the super rich. Other key suggestions included maintaining indirect tax rates at 12% and implementation of the Kelkar Committee recommendations. Industry is keen on phasing out diesel subsidies over the next 3 years, and divestment to the tune of 50,000 crore rupees is what India Inc. would like to see. Here's a look at what Corporate India had to say post that meeting.
My part, I mentioned very specifically that we are on the verge of making a very major investment, but we are held up by an uncertain regulatory regime. There is all this talk about taxes on diesel cars, and naturally then we balk at investment. So we want a very clear, predictable regulatory environment. I emphasize that the auto industry is a major component of the economy. 21% of excise collection, 22% of manufacturing GDP. It can be a major force in kickstarting the economy, so it should be treated as such.
Well, Anand Mahindra, they're calling for more certainty. We're now joined by Adi Godrej, President of the Confederation of Indian Industry, and Nellal Kidwai, President of FICCI. Appreciate you joining us here on India Business Hour. Mr. Godrej, let me start by asking you, the emphasis of the meeting, and this is what we seem to have picked up, is that on what the finance minister should not do in the budget as opposed to what he should do. I believe industry fiercely opposing the idea, the possibility of an inheritance tax or a tax on the super rich. Is India Inc. bracing itself for an inheritance tax or a tax on the super rich this time around? Remember, this is the Parthasarathy Shom Chidambaram combination, which is known for the introduction of new taxes.
No, we have very clearly said that such a thing would be a bad idea. The reason being that it would create a negative perception. Negative perceptions lead to negative trends on investment. And just like GAR and retrospective amendments created a negative perception in the last budget, we should avoid anything with negative perception. And I specifically mentioned at the meeting that inheritance taxes do not generally exist in the developing world. They are a developed world phenomenon where they are trying to get from 1% growth to 2% growth. Here we are trying to get from a 6% growth to an 8 or 9% growth. So anything that negatively affects sentiment would be not in the interests of growth and, to my mind, revenue collection. Even in the past, when estate duty was there, the costs of administering were higher than the collection.
All right, Nena, Adi Godrej making a vociferous argument for why the finance minister should not go ahead with the idea of an inheritance tax. But do you believe, given the current situation, that the finance minister may in fact consider implementing the inheritance tax in this budget? Could this be the red herring, just like the retrospective tax was the red herring in the last budget? Could inheritance tax or a tax on the super rich be the red herring in budget 2013?
I think if you were to take the views of all of us from industry around the table, we have all suggested that there be no increase in taxes in any of these criteria. Not income tax, not wealth tax, not inheritance tax. And in fact, the plea is that when it comes to taxing inheritance tax or wealth, it's important that we have savings, investments going into entrepreneurship, going into developing new projects, new investment, and therefore it was not the right time to look at these. Indeed, as one of the industry chambers pointed out, inheritance tax is very much a developed economy phenomenon. Two medium economies, Turkey has an inheritance tax, but no other developing country has an inheritance tax. So the reason to look at it in India was really not possibly the right one. So there was a uniform view suggesting that inheritance tax be imposed only after due consideration and much thought, and that we didn't think that was a good idea at all. I think equally on taxes across the board, we did not go into the specifics of service tax or excise duty, but the common refrain was, don't disturb the tax structure. We recognize you can't take it down. It would be great if you could, and there were some recommendations on that front as well, but broadly to at least maintain the tax structure as is.
All right, don't disturb the tax structure. But Mr. Godrej, let me pick up on the point that Nana was making there, and the talk around a higher rate of excise and service tax is gaining ground. The logic seems to be, let's align the rates preemptively as a step towards the goods and services tax. Is industry bracing itself for both a higher excise and service tax rate?
No, not at all. We think it would be a very bad idea to increase excise duty or service tax rates in this budget. And secondly, the expected central rates under a GST regime would be either the current 12% or 10%, certainly not higher.
Okay, but speaking of the GST, Mr. Godrej, and this is the indication that we're getting, so, let me check with you as to what's the sense that you're getting on the rollout of the GST. Do you believe the constitutional amendment for the GST will be moved in the budget session? Is that the sense you're getting?
Well, I don't think the budget could announce it. The GST would need a constitutional amendment in the budget session.
Okay, so you're saying we could see a constitutional amendment being moved in the budget session. But Nainal Kidwai, given the fiscal compulsions, the political compulsions, this after all is the full last budget before the general elections. Do you go into this budget with great expectations or no expectations?
I think, Shireen, there are many areas which can be addressed, and some of those have to do with tax administration. For example, transfer pricing. We have the IT sector, which is at $100 billion today, and it's a great mover of our GDP. While we look at putting manufacturing and investment back on the agenda, we cannot ignore what has contributed to the growth of our country. And 70% of all global litigation in transfer pricing relates to India. Now, shouldn't we be sorting out some of these issues to ensure that the natural advantage that our tech sector has, and India has that natural advantage, that we don't lose this by virtue of having a whole bunch of issues which are really around lack of clarity around transfer pricing. At the meeting, we also looked at certain industry areas. One of the ones that Ficky touched on was real estate, which is important because housing is often seen as an area which leads to growth. Housing starts are looked at by economists to indicate growth. It's a big employer. It also, of course, brings in cement and construction and industries on the back of it. And low-cost housing is a need in the country. So a certain focus and push for low-cost housing was something we also recommended.
All right, so you're saying that there should be emphasis on the real estate sector and a push towards low-cost housing. But Mr. Godrej, back to you. Given his fiscal constraints, do you really believe the finance minister can bat for growth, can revive the investment cycle? He does have to worry about the political constituency as well.
There's no question, Shireen, that he is in a difficult position. But the best way to tackle this difficult position is to collect more taxes through higher growth, not to higher rates of taxes. India has never been successful in increasing rates of taxes, whether direct or indirect, to collect more taxes. In fact, it's quite the other way around. And although currently the situation would need a fiscal stimulus, but we have suggested that we understand the difficulty in terms of the fiscal deficit. So we have not asked for a reduction in excise duty or service tax, but we have clearly stated that there should be no increases either.
Okay, but Mr. Godrej, there seems to be a feeling that the government is more focused on attracting FII and foreign capital. The finance minister, we learn, is doing roadshows abroad. Is industry getting a sense that there isn't much effort in attracting domestic capital, in getting the domestic climate to kick in?
Well, clearly domestic investment in terms of numbers far outshadows foreign investment. So we were very clear that various policies should be directed to encourage domestic investment, should be directed to encourage economic growth, and nothing should be done which could work to the contrary.
All right, Nana, let me end with you, because the Reserve Bank governor made comments last evening that inflation continues to be above the Reserve Bank's comfort zone and hence don't expect much in terms of monetary and fiscal stimulus, and that spooked the street. What do you now expect at the end of this month from the central bank?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that the governor continues to be cautious, because while we have seen inflation come down, it is not significantly down, and there are parts of it like food inflation which have actually gone up. However, I think that given that it hasn't come down in all this time, no matter what happens, I believe a lot of the inflation we see, particularly food inflation, is supply side inflation. It is not so much demand led. We just need better logistics, better distribution of food, better warehousing, etc. And that's not going to happen in a hurry. However, industry, on the other hand, is hurting very badly, and industry is looking at least for a signal that interest rates come down. So the hope and expectation that it comes down is still there. I'm sure that the governor has belled these notes of caution with a view to managing expectation. But maybe a small reduction, 0.25, is not out of place. I'm certainly hopeful still that in January we will see something. Of course, there are no guarantees. And certainly in the first quarter of the year, which is what I had maintained earlier, we must and should see a reduction. But I'm hoping it will be as soon as early January. Industry needs it, and we need to have those green shoots of investment back on our agenda.
All right, so the industry hoping that there will be a rate cut by the Reserve Bank, also hoping that the finance minister won't move and bring an inheritance tax or a tax on the super rich or disturb the tax structure. Adi Godrej, Nellal Kidwai, I appreciate you joining us here on India Business Hour. But we were talking about the GST.